I knew Muhammad Ali, not the way the world knew him. The world saw the fighter who danced and shouted and predicted rounds. They saw the man who called himself the greatest before he had any right to the title. They saw spectacle. I saw something else. I saw a man sit alone in a hotel room in Chicago and wonder if he'd made the right choice. I saw him quiet, and that is what I remember most. It was April of 1967 when I first sat down with him, really sat down not for a quick word after a fight, but for a conversation that neither of us seemed to want to end. The room was ordinary. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out on nothing important. He just refused induction into the armed forces. The news was everywhere. The government was moving against him. His title would be stripped, his license revoked. He knew all this. He looked at me and he said, "I feel free." That surprised me. I think I expected anger or defiance or one of those perfect statements he was known for. But he said it quietly, like a man who had set down something heavy and was only now realizing how long he'd been carrying it. We talked for 2 hours that day. He spoke about his faith, about the teachings he'd found in the Nation of Islam, about a God who asked him to be true even when the cost was high. He did not preach to me. He explained. There is a difference. He said he could not kill people in Vietnam when he had no quarrel with them. He said the enemy was not over there. He said if he was going to fight, it should be here, for his own people, for dignity, for justice. I asked him if he understood what he was giving up. He nodded. He understood. The world did not forgive him. I watched that happen too. The letters came into our newsroom by the hundreds. People called him a coward. They called him a traitor. They said he was hiding behind religion. They said worse things, things I will not repeat. He was young then, only 25, and I wondered how a man that young could stand against so much hate. I saw him again a few months later in New York. He was giving speeches now, traveling to colleges and churches, places that would still have him. He spoke without notes. He spoke with a certainty that made people uncomfortable. I stood in the back of a hall at Howard University and watched students lean forward in their seats. Some agreed, some did not, but they listened. Afterward, we walked together for a while. It was evening. The air was warm. He was quiet again, the way he'd been in that Chicago hotel room. I asked him if he ever doubted himself. Every day, he said. He told me about the night before his hearing in Houston. He said he lay awake wondering if he was doing the right thing, if his faith was real or if he was just afraid. He said he prayed until the sun came up. He said he asked God to show him the truth, even if the truth meant he was wrong. And what did you find? I asked. I found that I couldn't lie, he said. Not to them, not to God, not to myself. That was all. He didn't dress it up. He didn't make it grand. It was simple and it was final. The years that followed were hard. I watched from a distance, mostly, though we spoke a few times by telephone. He couldn't fight. He couldn't make a living the way he knew how. He gave speeches for money, small amounts, nothing like what he'd earned in the ring. There were rumors he was broke. There were rumors he regretted it. I don't know about the money, but I know he didn't regret it. I remember standing in the CBS newsroom in 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed. I remember thinking of Ali, of the stand he'd taken, of the hatred it had brought him. I wondered if he was afraid. I wondered if he thought about turning back, about apologizing, about finding a way to soften what he'd said. But he didn't. He kept speaking. He kept refusing. He kept saying no. The war went on. More men were drafted. More men died. And slowly, quietly, the country began to turn. Not all at once, not in any dramatic fashion, but people began to ask questions. They began to wonder if the war was worth it, if the cause was just, if the enemy was really the enemy. And some of them, though they would never say it out loud, began to think that maybe Ali had been right all along. I saw him again in 19... The legal battles were still going on. The appeals were working their way through the courts. But something had changed in the air. There were fewer people calling him a coward. There were more people calling him brave. He seemed older to me. Not physically. Physically, he looked the same, still strong, still quick. But his eyes were older. He'd seen something the rest of us hadn't. He'd stood alone when the cost of standing alone was everything. We sat in another hotel room, this time in Atlanta. I asked him if he thought he'd fight again. If they let me, he said. Do you want it to? He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him smile in years. I'm a fighter, he said. That's what I do. But it wasn't about the fighting. It never really was. I understood that then. The fighting was just what he did with his body. The stand he took was what he did with his soul. And the soul was the part that mattered. The Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 19... He was free to fight again. The years he'd lost could never be returned. The prime of his career, gone. But he came back anyway. He fought Joe Frazier in Madison Square Garden, and he lost, the first loss of his professional life. I watched that fight. I watched him take punches he might have avoided if he'd had those 3 years. I watched him fall, and I watched him get up. People asked me later if I thought he was still the greatest. I said I didn't know. I said it didn't matter. Greatness in the ring is one thing. Greatness in life is another. He'd already proven the second. The first was just a question of speed and timing and luck. What I remember most is not the fights or the speeches or the controversy. What I remember is the quiet, the moments when he wasn't performing, when he wasn't the man the world expected him to be, the moments when he was just a man trying to do what he thought was right. I remember the way he looked out that window in Chicago, watching the street below, saying nothing. I remember the sound of his voice on the telephone when he told me he didn't know if he'd made the right choice, but he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. I remember the silence between us in Atlanta when I asked him if it had been worth it, and he didn't answer right away because he was really thinking about it. Finally, he said, "I don't know if it was worth it, but I know I'd do it again." That's the truth of it. That's what people miss when they talk about Muhammad Ali. They talk about the legend and the showmanship and the fights. They forget the cost. They forget that he stood in front of the United States government and said no. They forget that he lost everything and gained it back and lost some of it again. They forget that he was a man, just a man, trying to be faithful to something larger than himself. I think about him sometimes even now. I think about that conversation in Chicago, the one where he said he felt free. I didn't understand it then. I thought freedom meant keeping what you had, not giving it away. But he understood something I didn't. He understood that you're only free when you're willing to lose everything for what you believe. History will remember him. That much is certain. But history has a way of smoothing out the rough edges, of making everything seem inevitable and right. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't easy. It was a choice made by one man in a moment when the cost of that choice was everything he'd worked for. I knew Muhammad Ali. I knew him in the quiet moments. And what I learned from him is this: conscience is not loud. Courage is not spectacle. The hardest thing a man can do is stand alone and believe he is right when the world is screaming that he is wrong. He did that. He stood alone. And in standing alone, he showed the rest of us what it meant to stand at all. That is what I remember. That is what matters. That is the man I knew. And that is the way it was. If you found value in this story, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Each week we bring you narratives like this one, stories of conscience, courage, and the moments that defined our time. Stories told not with spectacle, but with honesty. Not with noise, but with reflection. We explore the lives of those who stood at crossroads, who made choices that cost them dearly, who showed us what it means to be human in the face of impossible odds. These are not mere historical recaps. These are memories, conversations, and truths from those who were there. Click the subscribe button below. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter. They remind